around the place. You'll have just seen there that the meeting is being recorded initially for the first section. So we'll be recording our speakers, but then we won't record the Q&A. So as well as launching that paper, which we're very excited to do, we're also very excited to be launching our brand new Local Democracy Research Centre. This is a new venture for LGIU, and it has an academic focus. We're leaning towards the research that is being done in universities and working much more with academics, trying to bridge the sort of those two worlds that the LGIU with the other world that LGIU works in, which is in local government practice. We want to facilitate dialogue and share ideas between local government practitioners and academics. We know that there's a wealth of ideas being produced in academia, and we want to help our members throughout local government to be able to access it and use it. But we also know that there's a huge amount of really good stuff, really good ideas, innovative practice going on in local government, and we want to help academics access that for their research. And we want to be at the centre of co-producing practice-led research that asks really interesting, really crucial new questions about governance, democracy, public services, and institutions around local government. And the other crucial element of the Local Democracy Research Centre is that it is international. The report that we're publishing today is based on research in England, but our other work and the work that we want to do in the future is drawing from LGIU's international network of local government practitioners throughout England, Scotland, Ireland, Australia, South Africa, and beyond. As well as this paper, we're already doing a lot. We have a lot of other interesting stuff already on the go. We're doing a project with the University of Kent looking at various ways of measuring decentralisation across different systems of governance. We're doing some work looking at systems thinking and how systems thinking can help with health and well-being policy making. We're doing a piece of an international investigation looking at some of the opportunities that can be drawn on from climate change adaptation. And we are doing an investigation into how local authorities around the world are addressing health inequalities. So that's all to come, and there's lots more in the pipeline. So this is just the first of many, and we really want to work with you. So please get in touch if you've got interesting stuff going on. If we can help, if there are projects that we can get involved in or help support, we want to hear from you around our three broad themes that we're working on in the Research Centre, and they are firstly building sustainable places. Secondly, making devolution work. So that's looking at the mechanics of devolution and decentralisation. I think a lot of the time, we've made the argument for decentralisation and devolution, and actually there's a piece of work to do around, how do we take that forward? What are the mechanisms? What are the institutions? What are the behaviours and cultures that we need? And finally, capacities, knowledge, and evidence in local government. So those are our three broad themes. As I say, please get in touch. There are loads of ways that we can work together, short-term, long-term, in-depth, light touch. Please get in touch and let's have a conversation. But that's for the future. Today, as I mentioned, we are launching our new research paper, a new settlement, and we have a fantastic panel of expert speakers to discuss various elements of that paper and of some of the themes that we're looking at in the Research Centre. So it's going to work. You'll all be very familiar with the format. We're going to hear from our panellists. They'll each talk for somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes. And then there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So please have your questions ready. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand or stick it in the chat, or just say in the chat that you'd like to ask a question, and we will try to make sure that we can come round to everybody. So on the panel today, we have Dr. Patrick Diamond, who is a senior lecturer at the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University, and Patrick worked with us on the report. Dr. Arianna Giovannini, who is Associate Professor of Local Politics and Policy at De Montfort University, Professor James Mitchell, Professor of Public Policy at the School of Social and Political Science in the University of Edinburgh, Mark Callanan, who's a lecturer at the Institute of Public Administration in Dublin, and joining us a little later via video link due to various problems with time zone differences and so on, Professor Juliette Kayem, who is the Senior Lecturer in International Security at the Harvard School of Government, and has done lots of work with mayors and various other parts of municipal and local government in the States. So exciting to hear from her a little bit later on. There's one other note of thanks that I want to say, which is to Farah Hussein, who I think is in the audience, who was a co-author with me on the report. So Farah, if you're there, I can't quite see, but thank you very much. Thank you very much to you. Now, so without further ado, I will pass on to our first speaker, which is Patrick Diamond. Patrick.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. And let me just start by saying congratulations to you and LGIU for the launch, both of the report, but also for the centre which you are creating. I think it will fill an important space in public policy debate around local democracy, public services, institutions. So I'm really pleased to see that it's being launched today. I just want to make a few brief opening comments really about place shaping in English local governance, which is the core theme of the report and a lot of the work which I know LGIU have been focusing on in recent years. And my starting point for the discussion is really just to make a simple point, which is that in my view, place shaping isn't just a slogan. It does represent a serious alternative vision of how the country could be better governed. And moreover, the debate about place shaping is going to be integral to this broader discussion of how we can build back better after the pandemic. And I think that in the building back better discussion, there will inevitably be a lot of focus on issues like the state of the National Health Service, social care, dealing with some of the very real and deep inequalities that have been exposed by the pandemic. But there also needs to be a discussion about how the UK as a whole and England in particular can be better governed. I think the pandemic has really exposed some of the ways in which the governance structures in our country do not work as effectively and as well as they should. And we need to address that for the future, and taking stock of what has happened in the pandemic will be an opportunity to do that. The second point I want to make is that place shaping, in a sense, is by no means a new concept. If one was to trace the concept back in official government discourse, the Lyons Review of 2006 is the point at which we see the first kind of official discussion or endorsement of the idea of place shaping. But it does appear in earlier documents. And of course, if you go back to the 1980s, you can begin to see the beginnings of approaches to place shaping in different English local authorities, different ways of trying to work on economic development issues from a place-based perspective and so on. What I want to talk about though in my remaining time is not so much the history of the concept, but where we stand today and what prospects are for place shaping in governance. And here what I want to argue is that I think there is scope for both optimism and pessimism about the prospects for a serious drive on place shaping in English local government. And let me begin by just making a few points about reasons to be pessimistic, but then try to end on a more optimistic note about the viability of this agenda for the future. Okay, so on the pessimistic side, I think we have to be realistic and we have to recognise that councils that want to be active place shapers do face some very real constraints. One obvious constraint is finance. We know that in the last financial year, local councils in England faced an estimated shortfall of 7.2 billion, and that capacities and resources in many areas are in short supply. And that's bound to impact on the ability of councils to engage in productive place shaping activity. Moreover, councils have to work in a context where Whitehall departments and their appetite to centralise policy shows no signs of abating. And of course, that follows 40 years really of sustained centralisation and top-down performance management of public services as evidenced by instruments such as the use of output targets, which are attempts to control how public services are delivered. There have been, of course, various efforts by politicians and officials in central government to talk about ways in which they might be trying to let go of control of management of public services. But on the other side, we can see even recently how the ongoing demand for control shows no signs of being relaxed. And some of you will have noticed that a couple of months ago, the government announced the recreation of a delivery unit in Whitehall, which appears, at least at this stage, to really represent another attempt to intensify control of the management of public services. Beyond this, effective place shaping requires decentralisation of powers to communities and competencies to councils. But central government still appears reluctant to engage properly in a debate, in a real conversation with citizens about what these powers and competencies ought to be. And that was, of course, underlined by the recent cancellation of the devolution white paper and a widespread sense that the momentum around English devolution has been lost in recent times. So I think that these are all reasons to be, if not pessimistic, then certainly realistic about the prospects for active place shaping in local governance in England. But as I mentioned a moment ago, I think there is also some scope for greater optimism. In the project that Andrew mentioned at the beginning, we've looked at case studies in local authorities across the country, in places as diverse as Kirklees, Kent, Cornwall, Greater Manchester. And through this work, we've seen how effectively councils are helping to build networks, collaborations, and partnerships for community support, particularly in evidence during the pandemic crisis. COVID, I think, has also demonstrated that the excessive centralisation of policy leads to worse outcomes, as the experience of initiatives such as the NHS test and trace system underlines. It is clear, I think, from this crisis that public health strategies require an understanding of local context and knowledge, which is informed by place. And in the absence of those, policy interventions are likely to be ineffectual and not to deliver the outcomes that were intended. I think other scope for optimism is that there are new democratic structures emerging that may have the potential to further enhance active place shaping. Certainly among academics, there has been a considerable amount of skepticism about innovations around elected mayors, but we also have to recognise that they are having an impact on the governance landscape. Mayors in places such as Greater Manchester, Teesside, the West Midlands are becoming national political figures of significance. And this demonstrates that they do have something to offer in terms of solidifying, deepening the place shaping agenda. There are also new participatory approaches emerging, such as citizens' assemblies and place-based budgeting, which provide new ways of involving citizens in decision-making. There's also, I think, a greater recognition in the light of the Brexit referendum and the subsequent instability of the UK that a distinctive governance settlement for England is needed, and that place shaping through local government could be an important part of the answer. So look, Andrew, that's just a very brief overview for me about reasons to be both optimistic and pessimistic about the prospects for place shaping strategies and policy making in English governance. But let me just end my remarks very quickly by posing two questions about the future of this agenda that we might consider in our discussion today. The first is that, of course, all the evidence shows that place shaping in England as a strategy for local governance has unfolded in a somewhat asymmetrical and ad hoc fashion across English local authorities. There has certainly never been, and there is not in the immediate future likely to be, any grand plan for place-based policy making or place-based strategies. Do we think that this is a problem? Is it inevitable? What are its consequences and implications? I think this is an issue that we could talk about and would be useful to discuss. Second question, how will the place shaping agenda be reconciled with the government's big idea of levelling up? Levelling up has, of course, emerged as the signature strategy of the Johnson administration. But so far, levelling up really appears to imply spending on infrastructure and areas like transport and skills. But of course, place shaping, as our report shows, addresses a much broader conception of well-being than just economic development. And my question is really, how important is this? Can levelling up be reconciled with this broader conception of place shaping? How might we do that in the future? So those are just, I think, two important questions that we could discuss. Of course, there are many others, and I really look forward to people's comments and thoughts this morning. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, really, really important questions for us to get into, and you know, thanks also for the optimism as well. I think that's quite an important thing for us to keep bringing back into the debate, when we can quite often get a bit gloomy when we talk about devolution. So that's really important. Thank you. Arianna.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks also, well, first of all, for the excellent paper. I fully echo what Patrick just said, and also thanks to Patrick for his opening remarks, which to some extent match some of the things that I want to say, but I'll try not to repeat what he has already outlined, but just maybe expand a bit more on that. I think if we look at the work that has been done through the paper, I think that it really highlights the key issue at stake, and this reflects also what Patrick just said, that calling for a new settlement for place that reconnects the current levelling up agenda with devolution. That is a very is a major disconnect that is emerging right now, and I think that the report is absolutely right in saying that until you create a bridge between these two agendas, well, none of them is likely to be particularly successful going forward. So how do we make devolution work in that sense? Well, there is no doubt that place matters. The pandemic has clearly demonstrated that. Patrick has just explained how and why. And we really learned throughout the pandemic, we learned the hard way that decisions taken by the government in London do not necessarily reflect the needs of local communities. And at the same time, really, the pandemic has strengthened the sense of community and the need to kind of be together, create resilience from the bottom up, highlighting how and why local government and locally rooted leadership really matters. But there remains the big sort of elephant in the room, and that's central government, the attitude of central government. Central government has gone cold on devolution recently. As Patrick mentioned, the white paper on devolution now is not just postponed, but apparently is going to be kind of subsumed into a new levelling up white paper, which suggests that the devolution agenda will become just one of the headings within that broader agenda. And that doesn't seem to bode particularly well for what might happen in the future. At the same time, new streams of fundings are tightly controlled by the centre, and in a way, Patrick is very right in saying that what we are seeing within the activity of the new metro mayors, the new metro mayors emerging as agents of change from the bottom up is very important. But what sort of reaction will that generate at the center? Will the center actually see them as agents of change and embrace that kind of more bottom up approach? Or is that an excuse to give even more resistance to the idea of devolution? Because this is a form of leadership that clearly, especially in certain areas like Greater Manchester, challenges the authority of the centre. So that's a bit problematic. So what needs to be done to make devolution work? I'll mention just a couple of points because there is a lot to cover, but I think that the starting point is certainly the need to rethink in a most profound way and change how centre-local relations work in this country. Certainly sustainable funding for local government is essential, as suggested in the report, but my feeling is that it is becoming increasingly clear that without any sort of constitutional protection for local government, essentially local authorities and the process of devolution with that are increasingly just at the mercy of central government. And this means that devolution, as we have seen, has developed in fits and starts, and it is essentially at the whim of the government of the day. And one of the main problems in recent years has been that there have been periods with a strong focus on devolution. Let's think about the George Osborne era, let's call it. And then the agenda gets to a point when it completely stalls, such as under Theresa May. And then it becomes something, it could also become something that helps the government to achieve something else, like in the case of the debate around levelling up right now. So under the current government, where there is a kind of a rhetoric of empowering localities, but at the same time, this has to be delivered through an agenda of leveling up that is tightly controlled by the center. So my feeling is that until this relationship change, until local government is really in a bit of a stronger position, then devolution cannot work properly. So this needs to change, and constitutional protection for local government is needed to ensure that plans cannot be changed overnight, and there is a need for a long-term commitment to devolution that goes beyond purely party political interest and puts people in place at the heart of the devolution agenda. So something that gives devolution a clear direction of travel and a sort of long-term commitment. So a settlement that, let's say, takes 10 years, and irrespective of whoever is in government, what party is in government, that commitment is taken forward. The current model of devolution is also highly competitive, as Patrick mentioned, and is based on deals and bids. And this is good for some areas. We've seen it, for example, in places like Greater Manchester or the T-Valleys. In the T-Valleys, for example, where there is a very kind of a mayor with a very entrepreneurial approach, if you like. Well, that's the kind of environment that where local leadership can strive. Of course, in that case, the links with central government also help to get good deals in a way. In Greater Manchester, on the other hand, we've seen like the presence of a kind of a stronger and more ingrained institutional capacity and legacy that has helped to negotiate more powers with central government, and also an emerging form of strong leadership that has helped to kind of get a good deal out of devolution. But what about other places? What about places where there is not a strong institutional kind of legacy and history of collaboration across members councils that are members of the combined authorities, or where there isn't a strong mayor? So what about places that have been so far left behind from devolution? There is a risk in this sense that this competitive approach to devolution can be very good for some areas, but can also create a lot of disadvantages. It can create losers of devolution in other parts. And so again, there is a problem. We go back to leveling up. How do you level up the country where only some areas can benefit from this competitive approach? So here, for me, if we want to see devolution working in a proper way, there is a need to move from a model of devolution that is competitive to one that is actually flexible and open, and most importantly, available to all areas at their own pace and with adequate funding and powers. This is something that is missing, and I think that this type of approach would make devolution a process that can actually benefit all people and places, and not just a selected few. That need to improve central-local relations, again, is essential. If we look at comparisons with other countries with a functioning system of devolution, that shows that very often central local relations are based also on or are supported by the presence of some kind of formal forums for discussions. So in countries like Italy, there are official committees that are like the Center and Region Committee or the Center and Local Government Committee. And whenever a decision is taken on any matter that affects the regions or localities, well, the leaders have to be consulted. This is missing in England in particular, and I think that it would really help if there was something like that in place, especially to drive the creation of that devolution framework that has been promised for so long that, I can't even remember when the promises started, but has never been delivered. So create a framework for devolution that is flexible, that allows people, that allows places to join at their own pace, that is based on adequate power and funding, but that is also co-designed by central government and subnational governance representatives, and is not just imposed from the bottom up. So these are kind of the big structural issues, if you like, that need to be tackled to make devolution work. But if we look at the kind of perspective from local government and local authorities, I think that, and Patrick has already highlighted some of this, there are a lot of good examples of how local authorities can make a lot out of the very little kind of resources and funding that has been passed down to them through devolution. In a way, I think that the results of the recent Metro Mayor election have clearly shown that the mayors who have harnessed the power of place and use effectively their soft powers have been rewarded at the local level by the local communities. The different mayors are kind of developing different styles and approaches to this type of local leadership. In Greater Manchester, again, if we look at the two kind of examples of the mayors that won with the highest level of support in the Tees Valley, certainly, as I mentioned before, Ben Houchen has used a more kind of an entrepreneurial approach. He can use more opportunity structures because, of course, he's got a direct line of contact with central government. But at the same time, it is very clear if we look at his key messages for the campaign, for example, and what he has done during his first mandate, it's very clear that no matter or despite this tight link with central government and the opportunity that comes from that, he has placed a very strong emphasis on place. So the idea of putting the Tees Valley back on the map is something that speaks not just to central government, but also to local communities about place, belonging, identity, and civic pride as well. So that is something important that is kind of developing from the bottom up. In Greater Manchester, something similar has happened, although using a different style. More recently, Andy Burnham has used a more of a kind of an oppositional approach to central government, and yet has been very, very effective in making use not just of his soft power, but also of the symbolic powers attached to the idea of presenting himself as a leader that can stand up to central government and to protect the local communities in Greater Manchester. And he has done on the symbolic dimension something that is even more remarkable in a way. He has created a sense of identity in a place that has got no historical identity. And that is really something that shows that difference, that place of harnessing the power of place can really make a big difference. But there are also places without mayors. I don't want to say that mayors are the solution to everything, because there are also places like Cornwall where there is a devolution deal without a mayor, and yet the strong focus on community, developing a collaborative approach to governance in the region has made a difference as well. So a lot of good examples emerging from the bottom up, from the local level. And this is important because it is showing that devolution is gaining something that it didn't have at the beginning, and that's popular support. And perhaps going forward, that could be used even more effectively to put pressure on the government to create cracks in the system that maybe break that kind of very top-down center-local type of center-local relationship that we have in the country. Excuse me for a second. Sorry, I didn't want to cough live. And just to conclude, I think that there are quite a lot of things could change from the bottom up, but there remain that issues of whether central government will open up to this new local pressures. The current signs, as Patrick has very well explained, are not particularly positive. There is perhaps a need, if we want to create that crack in the system that really opens up to a new way of doing devolution, perhaps there is a need to focus even more from the local level on putting pressure on the center by emphasizing even further the use of soft powers and building strong local networks. So I think that that's the only way in which these things can happen. And the main goal now, there are a lot of good examples at the local level. The main goal now is to make sure that the government opens up and starts to listen rather than continue to kind of use a top-down approach to devolution. That's all for me. Thanks.
Arianna, thank you. Loads of really interesting, really useful reflections there. So please do pop any questions, any comments you have in the chat, and we'll come to those in a second. But Arianna, thanks. I think there was lots of really fascinating stuff for us to get into a bit later. And I particularly like the idea that there's lots of really good stuff happening in local areas. There's lots of, that there are interesting innovations in governance going on. We're not sort of starting from nowhere with a blank sheet of paper. And so that's a cause for optimism. It creates challenges, but that's where we are. Thanks, Arianna, really useful. Now we're going to go over to James Mitchell.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the report and for the earlier comments. I would say about the report that though the focus is on England, much in it resonates for anyone who follows debates in Scotland. Indeed, I think Scotland is really operating in parallel. There's some differences, but broadly speaking, I think the similarities are striking. I've been asked to talk about capacity, and in 5-10 minutes, that's a challenge. But I want to start by making the point that capacity comes in different shapes and forms. We tend to focus on finance, and that's important, and I'll certainly be saying something about that. But capacity and the resources associated with capacity are various and many. They include people, they include technology, they include time. One of the things I think we often fail to take into account in terms of achieving better outcomes is that some outcomes take time, and we don't always have time, and we do tend to operate in policy making in the short term. The longest term is often in terms of electoral cycles. So we do need to consider those various different forms of resources as well. I think one of the things that we've seen during the pandemic is, first and foremost, is of course that there's been increased demand, and demand on public services and local government has been increasing, and had been increasing obviously prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has heightened that in many respects, and I think Patrick's absolutely right. What the pandemic has really done is exposed, as much as anything, some of the weaknesses, and also shown up some of the strengths that we have in our local communities. But the pressures have been building up, and one could mention many of these, but I think one of the ones that concerns me most is the growing elderly population, and that has meant that we're seeing a real shift in the need to consider how we should go about it. But I would also point out that growing population, elderly population, is also a resource. And I think anyone who's spent any time with community groups across any part of the country will be aware that, our elderly population are playing an enormous part in community activities, and shouldn't just be seen as a problem. They're also a major resource. And I think one of the things that we've seen during the pandemic has been, up here certainly, and I suspect in England for sure as well, has been the way in which local government and community groups have managed to work very well together. Local government often acting as a facilitator and ensuring that a great deal of work has been done that hopefully won't be lost, and we'll learn lots of lessons from that, because I think that's a crucial relationship between the community groups and local authorities. To come back to the finances, I mean, financial situation which local government finds itself in Scotland is no different from south of the border, other than that we're a wee bit more fortunate. We're a couple of years behind England in terms of cuts, but we are heading in exactly the same direction. And what we've seen over time, over generations in truth, is that when we move into difficult financial times, fiscal times, that local government tends to get the kicking. It's local government that gets cut. So in a sense, it's not so much devolution of power, it's devolution of penury. The problems are dumped on local authority without necessarily providing the resources. And of course, as we've seen, that the grant element to local authorities' financial resource, has increased. It has meant that central government's control has increased, and a cut there can be very, very severe. And what we're seeing here, as we've seen across the UK, is that central government protects its own resources. And, to give Scotland as an example, back 20 years ago when the Scottish Parliament was established, about a third of the funds, the devolved funds, went into local government, about a third went into health, and a third went into everything else. Well, that's completely changed, and health now eats up over 40%, 43, 44% of the Scottish Government's budget now. And the main loser in all of this has been local government. So that tendency has been very, very strong, and it's difficult to see how that can be challenged without some very radical rethinking of the Constitution of the United Kingdom. And I'm very much taking my Ariana's point about constitutional protections. I think one of the things we don't have is sufficient constitutional protection for local authorities. I'm an advocate, or at least I've proposed that there should be a second chamber to the Scottish Parliament in which local authorities should have a voice and indeed a veto in decision making. At the moment, local authority can have a voice, but it can be ignored. It doesn't have the constitutional power. And I would actually go further and suggest, I mean, this is getting into the realms possibly of fantasy in some people's minds, but I think we need to look at, if we're going to look at the reform of the House of Lords, the second chamber, we should be looking at a House of Nations, regions and local authorities. We desperately need to do that in order to ensure that it's not just shouting from the outside, but the decision making should be within the institution. So when we talk about devolved government, decentralisation and such like, we should never lose sight of the need for reform at the centre, as well as decentralising all the way down. I want to also warn people in England that regional government and the kind of idea of federal government and such like, what is, I think it's quite an attractive proposition, does not necessarily lead to local government being empowered. Over 20 years of devolution now in Scotland, we've seen local government continue to lose powers. That was not envisaged. At the outset, it was envisaged that the Scottish local authorities would be big winners, that they would gain responsibilities, or at least they wouldn't lose responsibilities. But we've seen an ineluctable process of local authorities losing out to central government, not just financially, but in other respects. And of course, even with the finances, a significant amount of the funding that comes to local government comes with strong strings attached. And there are numerous examples of it. One of the ones I often refer to is, of course, up here is that teacher numbers, teacher pupil ratios are set by the Scottish government, regardless of the needs of a local authority. And I can certainly take you to schools in Scotland where that resource would be better spent on breakfast clubs and other things which would help the communities and pupils in these schools. So I think we've got to ask ourselves how we can release, as it were, central government from local controls, how we can actually let go, because I think that's part of the problem. The other thing I want to mention here, because this is the 10th anniversary this summer of the publication of the Christie Commission report. I was a member of that commission, and it was we were charged with looking at the future delivery of public services. We concluded 10 years ago that we needed to change the way we were doing it. We needed to empower citizens. We needed to empower communities. We needed to have a big shift towards prevention. We needed to have more efficiency. We needed more collaboration and integration of public services. 10 years on, I'm not convinced that we've made as much impact as we ought to have. And I asked myself a question, and indeed the question I probably asked more than any other question in terms of public policy, at least over the last decade, is why is it that if everybody is agreeing that we should be doing this, why is it not happening? And I have to say, I think there are a number of reasons. One is that there's a lot of people talk the talk, but they do not walk the walk. There's a massive shift, a gap rather, between the rhetoric and the reality on the ground. And we do need to kind of, I think, expose that, highlight that. And I think we've got to do that pretty ruthlessly and very publicly, embarrass people, frankly, because I do find, and maybe it's just because I'm getting older, that the rhetoric of politics is just so irritating, and it's not helping us. But there are other reasons I think it's very difficult to make some of these shifts, and I don't think that we truly encourage it. We don't incentivize these shifts, and of course there are enormous vested interests. Just to take but one example, as I'm running out of time here, but I'm very conscious of the fact that we talk a lot about public health in Scotland and in the UK, but we tend to equate that with the National Health Service. In reality, and you bring this out very powerfully in the paper, you show that actually public health is often performed by local authorities. It's often in those areas that are being cut most. It's leisure and recreation that plays such a significant part in preventing poor health outcomes, mental and physical. And I think we've got to have a much more holistic approach to public health. And we've got to start asking questions as to whether the National Health Service is frankly doing a good job. The problem is, of course, the National Health Service in this country is a bit of a religion, and you're not allowed to do these things, at least if you want to get elected to anything. So I think there are some big challenges ahead, but at some point I think we've got to challenge some of the myths, we've got to expose some of the rhetoric, and I think we've got to take some of these things a bit more seriously than we have. I'm convinced we can, and I hope others are as up for the battle as I am. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Yeah, really lots of really interesting points, and really interesting to have a bit of the sort of the Scottish context there as well, and to hear a bit about the Christie Commission, which, as you mentioned, has not maybe borne the fruits that you hoped it would. But I think that point about sort of the health spend being maintained whilst others are sort of cut away, and the fallacy of that, because we know that that health outcomes are the product of a whole range of things, not just health spend, and so it's a false economy. But also really interesting point about that trying to find a institutional voice for local government at the centre of government, I think is really important, and one that's really interesting for us to think a bit more about. Thank you so much. Now we're going to go to Mark Callanan from the Institute of Public Administration in Dublin. Mark.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you to Andrew and his colleagues as well for the invitation to contribute this morning. So I suppose the brief that Andrew gave me was to, I suppose, to look on from another jurisdiction and to, by extension, maybe give a well, international, if we can count an Irish perspective as an international perspective on the paper, which I found very interesting to look at, and I suppose a couple of points resonated with me from an Irish point of view. Obviously, some of the terminology and the vocabulary would be a little bit different in an Irish context, but certainly there are a lot of common themes based on reforms here over the last number of years, and particularly in the COVID context as well. So in terms of place-based policy making, I think we could say that there have been sort of formal arrangements that largely rely on what the paper referred to as soft power, the soft power of local councils in place in Ireland since the late 1990s. And they've gone through various iterations. They've been called different things. There have been changes of names and some changes in composition, but essentially shared the same mandate, which was developing a medium to long-term strategy or policy framework for the future development of individual cities and counties over a 6-year, sometimes even a 10-year framework, and involving interaction between local councils, but also various public bodies with the local presence, and of course private and voluntary sector actors and NGOs. I suppose the view on this side of the Irish Sea would tend to be that lots of constructive things, as I think Ariana mentioned in her contribution, lots of constructive things can be done through soft power, and lots of positive things can be done through soft power. But we can also run up against the limits of this way of working, and they're time consuming. They translate into lots of meetings and interagency work and inter-organizational work is complex. I suppose that there has been developments here as well in the context of COVID, and again, I was interested in the paper in terms of looking at the role of local government leading a sort of a place-based response to the pandemic. And again, in the Republic of Ireland, that's tended to involve both statutory but also non-statutory roles for local government. So on the statutory side, obviously, around things like delivering supports for business, both financial and non-financial, but also reimagining and adapting areas to sort of enhance the outdoor experience, and also seeing the pandemic as perhaps a strategic opportunity to improve public realm spaces and things like that. But I think on the more informal side, I think that there was an initiative here that might be of interest to the audience around what we called here Community Call, which was a national initiative, but where local government sort of led the coordination at a local level of the statutory and voluntary sector response to the needs of the most vulnerable, particularly in the first lockdown from March 2020. Very operational stuff like delivering, food and shopping and medical supplies to those cocooning, as we called it here, the over 70s and the medically vulnerable. And I think there's been some research here in the Irish context that suggests that that's been quite a positive experience. Again, I was interested in the paper where, it's an opportunity to maybe reset the relationship between local councils and the community and voluntary sector, where, if you like, in the midst of the crisis, you know, what was seen as a sort of a national emergency, the organizational agendas that can traditionally plague, pardon the pun, plague inter-organizational work. Right, so we all come with chips on our shoulder around, you know, how we work better together. That was just melted away. You know, it melted away very, very quickly, and you know, there was a sense, you know, what can we do? There were a lot of people banging around saying, you know, how can I contribute? How can I do something? And to the extent that attention is now turning in the Irish context as how we can build on that positive experience, is there a way in which we can sort of reset that relationship between, if you like, the local councils, other public service organizations, but also the wider stakeholders and community voluntary sector. So another theme that I thought was interesting in the paper, again, maybe looking on it from an Irish perspective, was, you know, thinking about new ways of engaging with communities, and something Patrick mentioned as well in his contribution. I suppose we've developed something of a reputation here in Ireland as being something of an innovator in that respect, in terms of, I suppose, that the higher profile things would be citizens' assemblies and previously constitutional conventions. But at a local level as well, there's been quite a lot of experimentation around, you know, trying out different ways of trying to interact with local communities. Some formal that has sort of been applied across all local councils, and some more particular to particular local authority areas. So again, there have been sort of formal arrangements in place since the 1990s. For example, subcommittees of local councils here that have a policy mandate must contain at least a third of members who are not councillors. So they make policy recommendations to the elected council, but a third of the membership must be non-councillors. So typically, for example, an economic development a subcommittee of the council might contain representatives from, for example, local chamber of commerce, or housing committee might contain tenants representatives and things like that. So they make policy, they have a policy mandate. They don't take the final decision on policy frameworks, but they make recommendations to the full elected council. And the experience with that kind of structure, to be honest, has been rather patchy. Some of these committee structures work quite well and constructively, others not so. Not surprisingly, perhaps a lot comes down to the personalities involved. But there's been also, I suppose, different experiments as well in individual areas. You know, Dublin City, for example, have an initiative called the Beta Projects, which is essentially a digital platform to propose and trial new projects to improve well-being for residents and businesses in the city. So, for example, how can we make improvements around things like cycling infrastructure, or waste, or public realm improvements, play streets, open streets, and etc. And again, other experiments that I think Patrick mentioned around things like participatory budgeting at a neighbourhood level. These have all been experiments that we've sort of looked at in the Irish context. And I noted with interest as well some of the case studies, I think, in the paper that I thought were interesting and resonated around things like, you know, cooperation between local authorities. Again, in the Irish context, we would have sort of, you know, a good track record, I think, of, for example, you know, shared service arrangements, but also cross-border cooperation between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland in different contexts. And again, that's been an area that's been a focus around the post-COVID environment, and how we can sort of build on existing sets of relationships. But look, there was just maybe a few thoughts from looking at the paper from an Irish perspective, and obviously happy to expand on anything during the Q&A, and looking forward to the discussion. So thanks, Andrew.
Mark, thank you. They're really useful, really interesting insights. It's really good to get a perspective from is an international perspective. It's close by, but it's certainly international, and it's certainly a different framework to the one that we're used to here. So it's really useful. And I think there's lots of interesting parallels and differences. You know, that idea of resetting relationships between communities and government is clearly one that is being grappled with here and has been for some time. And you know, there's lots of interesting experiments and initiatives going on in Ireland that we can clearly learn from, and I'm interested to sort of hear a bit more about how they are learned from in the Irish context as well, because I think one of the issues that's come out from all of the presentations, and it's been raised in the chat as well, is something we can come back to in the discussion. I think there's a certain sort of collective amnesia that I think we go through a lot in all sorts of policy discussions, not just as it relates to local government, but it's an interesting one to reflect on, I think. Look, we're going to have one more international contribution, and this is from slightly further afield, and we thought that it would be unfair to ask Juliette Kayam to get up in the middle of the night to give us her thoughts. So she has very kindly recorded us a short video, which we are going to show you now. I think, yes, here we are. Yeah, Juliette, over to you.
Hi, my name is Juliette Kayam. I'm a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where I teach in Homeland Security and Global Health Security. I have a background in Homeland Security as a former Assistant Secretary at the US's Department of Homeland Security, and have spent the last 18 months advising mayors and governors here in the United States about local planning, local response, communication, and a path forward. So I'm thrilled by what you are doing over there, and thought I would, instead of being able to join you, just provide some insights from my work and where I think that your work is so essential as we head well into 2021. And the split screen of 2021, right? In other words, the bad news continues, but the good news and the light at the end of the tunnel are something to celebrate. So a couple of takeaways in terms of local leadership. Obviously, the best decisions were ones that were made early. In other words, you could just, we know what it looks like, right? In other words, so with imperfect information, local leaders who can make decisions early and act on them ended up being more successful, even if the information was imperfect. And I think that's something we have to get used to, that there was the problem with a crisis like this, as we see with climate change and others, is because it's slow roll, right? And there's not some moment of reckoning. There's not like, oh, all of a sudden we're in a pandemic. It's sort of coming at you like the tidal wave. We have to be better about how we're making decisions and making them early, and not waiting for either federal or national leadership, which we're lacking in many of our countries. I think second, even though this was a global pandemic, the extent to which people really did rely on their local leadership, in particular on communication, was clear. At least in the United States, the data did not change significantly. Yes, we have the fights between the Trump administration and the scientists and the Biden administration and Republican governors, or whatever political divisions you can find. We certainly have them in every country. But it is true that most people still were looking to their local leadership for facts, for data, and I think for constant communication. It put a lot on local leaders in terms of a steady drumbeat and having to constantly communicate imperfect information. But if, to the extent that leaders could provide numbers and hope, right? Those are the two things people want. They want to know what's going on, and they want to know that there's a pathway forward. I think the third thing to remember, which I think in some ways is a counter to the notion that we should follow the science, is whether we gave voice enough to the economic impacts that some of our medical decisions would be making. I don't know the right answer to this. I'm not a doctor, but I certainly know it as a mother in terms of schools, the decision to close schools and the long-term impact that has. And here in the United States, how hard it was to reopen many schools as compared to, say, Israel or other countries that were a little bit more ambitious with school reopenings. the economic impact on small businesses and what kind of money we can get to them to provide resources. All of those things, I think, are part of our critical infrastructure, which we tend not to think of as critical infrastructure. We have to get more sophisticated in weighing some of the challenges that accrue based on our scientific or medical decisions. Fourth, I think, is just ways in which, as we head out of this, the political pressure that tends to come from national governments, right? The fighting that we see and everything, which is so somewhat consistent in many of our countries, can be isolated from what is going on in our communities. We tend to focus on all the bad, the divisions, the fighting, but the truth is that across the globe, there's actually a center that sort of gets this and also gets the pathway out. Now, as for the pathway out, that's going to be different depending on where you are, the economic impact, and just some things to think about. We are, I hate the term the new normal. We're sort of in a now normal, which is most of our countries are opening up or trying to open up, but there will still be COVID, and then we will still be working around the pandemic. And you keep trying to push people to get vaccination. You hope that you can get ahead of any variants. But there will be closures, there will be pivoting, there will be, every day will be slightly different. So thinking about what that now normal is, because you know, school district could open and then have to close again. The second is, of course, what our cities will look like as we think about work from home and whether society has changed significantly in terms of travel and how we've decided to work, especially in Western Europe and the United States. I think there'll be competition for how we work. Some people will want to go in, some people won't, and there'll be self-selection. But it is going to be something that will have a tremendous impact on tax bases and other local, the status quo, or the status quo 2019 before COVID, and what it means for how we think about cities. Third, I think that we are heading towards, at least for 2021 and maybe for parts of 2022, depending on where the EU is and the globe and Britain and Canada and the US, let alone Africa and South America, is to really think about our society as sort of divided between benefits and burdens about vaccination. I think the EU made it absolutely clear when it said, we welcome back Americans, but you have to prove vaccination. And I think what you're starting to see in a lot of these countries is, instead that have some vaccine hesitancy or don't have enough vaccine, is to think about how do you make the vaccinated world more fun? That's basically it. Get to take cruises, get to go to the EU, get to hear Bruce Springsteen on Broadway. He has insisted that everyone be vaccinated. Major concerts, sporting events, all those kinds of things. The Olympics, as we may see if they don't get canceled. And I think that's the way the world is going to look. So as local leadership thinks about the benefits and burdens rather than requirements, how do you want to shape that for employees, employers, and public facilities? Anyway, so much to talk about. I've probably already gone over, but I just want to thank you for what you're doing. We tend to think of these things as global phenomenon, but they're really hand-to-hand combat at the community level. And so the work that's being done on the local and regional level is really what saves lives, what protects people, protects our first responders, and gets vaccines into as many arms as possible. So best of luck as we enter a now normal, not the new normal, for the months ahead. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, I think that point about the now normal is